The views expressed on Skeptically Speaking do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the University of Alberta, the Students' Union, or CJSR.
Bring it on! The skeptics await your letter. Your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Desiree Shell gonna raise a little hell, metaphorically that is. 'Cause we're skeptically speaking.
Hello and welcome to Skeptically Speaking. I'm your host, Desiree Shell. On our program, we talk incessantly, really, about the value of critical thinking and analysis, of research, of thinking beyond the headlines and questioning everything. Conspiracy theories are proof that you can take even good mental habits way too far. They're a great example of logic gone wrong. They focus on small inconsistencies and use them as a basis to question fundamentally sound conclusions. They spin tales about improbably intricate plots, and they twist and mangle the evidence to support their claims. And you see the same faulty logic in all kinds of conspiracy theories, from crop circles and the moon landing all the way up to the belief that the U.S. government blew up the World Trade Center. Today on Skeptically Speaking, we're going to look at some of these theories and see if we can work out the common threads of faulty logic that tie them all together. We'll be speaking with Karl Mamer, host of the podcast, The Conspiracy Skeptic. But first, some speaking up. I'm talking with Josh Witten, geneticist in Cambridge, UK, and one of the writers at thefinchpea.com. Welcome to Skeptically Speaking, Josh.
Hi, Des. How are you doing?
Very well. Thanks for being here.
Oh, no problem. My pleasure.
So you're here to tell us about how evolutionary theory explains why some ideas can persist in culture even when there isn't any evidence to support them, and actually especially if they've been proven wrong.
Yeah, I think where I started from in the scientific realm was the prevalence of using natural selection and adaptation to try to explain everything. Evolutionary theory has come a long way, and there are other considerations, but the complexity of evolutionary theory is really difficult to communicate to the public because not everybody has the biological background to understand the systems that you're using to try and talk about evolutionary theory. So I thought I would take a look at something that we all have a little better intuitive understanding of because we deal with it every day, which is how different ideas, or as Richard Dawkins would call them, memes, propagate through the population. And in particular, the popular fallacy that because something has been popular or been used for a long time, that means it must be good or okay or safe, because otherwise people wouldn't have been using it for so long or it wouldn't have become so popular.
And so you're saying that's wrong?
The assumption that it's correct is not accurate. We need to start from trying to figure out how ideas would propagate if they actually had no advantage or even harmful to people before assuming that anything that is popular or has been around for a long time has an advantage.
So are we talking about treating ideas like living organisms then?
I like to think about evolutionary theory treating living organisms like replicating units. Replicating units is really what evolutionary theory is concerned with, not necessarily specifically biological replicating units. And in that way of thinking, ideas which also replicate and spread from person to person are also replicating units, and therefore fair game for evolutionary theory to take a look at.
So you say that the theory can apply to any system that's built of units that have three characteristics. So what are those?
Three characteristics that I generally think about for this are that the units are discrete. That means that you can identify individual units that are replicating, that there's variation within those units so that you can get different varieties of each one. Go back to genetics. This is where you have genes that can be discrete or individual animals that are discrete, and then you have different varieties of those. And then those units need to be able to replicate. If they can't replicate, they can't spread.
So these characteristics are obvious in genes. Where do we see those in ideas?
A little bit less intuitive to try and apply something that concrete to ideas, but the simple way I talked about it is that ideas are discrete, so that I use the ice cream example. So I have a favorite flavor of ice cream, you have a favorite flavor of ice cream, and the idea of what is the best flavor of ice cream is a discrete idea. But you and I may disagree on what our favorite flavor of ice cream is. If you disagree and say that it's bubblegum flavored ice cream, which I can't stand, I can try to argue with you and convince you that mint chocolate chip is the best flavor of ice cream. And if I do, then my idea has replicated and spread to your brain. And you might go on and try to convince other people that mint chocolate chip is fantastic.
So you're saying that the replicating actually happens through talking to other individuals rather than through sex, which is how we would usually share genes.
For ideas, the method of replication is usually discussion with people or publication of your ideas in a paper that people will read, any form of communication between people.
How do ideas evolve?
Common perception of evolution, when we think about replication, what we normally think about is fitness differences. So that means that one thing has an advantage over another, and that manifests itself in the one with the advantage replicating faster or replicating more, generally being more successful, and therefore, due to that advantage, it comes to be dominant in the population. And that works really, really well when you deal with idealized groups of things where you're essentially dealing with an infinite number of individuals replicating. But in real systems, you don't have an infinite number of individuals, and so you get these random effects where an individual with no advantage over another individual may replicate a little bit more than that one just due to chance. And this effect gets larger and larger as the number of individuals in the system you're talking about gets smaller and smaller. So it's a little bit like flipping a coin where we expect to get heads half the time and tails half the time. If you do an infinite number of flips, you will get exactly that ratio. But if you only do 10 flips of the coin, you may get 5 heads, 5 tails, but you also may get 6 heads and 4 tails, or occasionally even 10 heads and 0 tails. And when we apply this concept to evolutionary theory, we call it drift. So when we're talking about ideas, we need to think about how many individuals are sharing ideas in the system in order to be able to figure out essentially how large an effect random chance plays in the propagation of ideas. And if the number of people who are actually in the business of sharing ideas and sort of deciding what ideas are good and bad isn't very large, then it becomes quite likely that we're going to have ideas, even ones that are actually slightly bad for us, that will propagate through the population.
So you mentioned initially having the things that have no effect, but if they actually have a negative effect, shouldn't that kind of be weeded out?
In general, it will be, but there's a concept in evolutionary theory known as the effective population size. And so this is sort of a theoretical construct that we use to describe how large a population of individuals engaging in essentially random exchange of, and normally we talk about this, we talk about genes, but essentially it's a number of people randomly interacting with each other and exchanging the units of replication that we need to have in order to describe the behavior of the larger population. And it is invariably a smaller number than the absolute size of the population. And that determines how efficient selection is in weeding out bad ideas or promoting good ideas. And as that number gets smaller, the efficiency of selection goes down and the influence of drift increases. And so essentially the ability to determine whether or not an idea is good, bad, or neutral diminishes.
The random drift effects explain why an idea can persist in the culture even if it's basically been disproven?
Essentially, it persists in the population because, one, that there may not actually be selection acting against it. So you're just having to wait for chance to remove it from the population. And even under selection, the more common an idea becomes, it still can take quite a while to eliminate something even that has a negative effect from the population, unless it essentially has an extremely deleterious effect.
What would an example of that be? Because basically what you're saying is an idea has to be really, really awful before the selection will weed it out.
Before it'll weed it out very efficiently. It should weed out things that have small but not negligible negative effects in all likelihood. I mean, one of the issues that I was trying to raise with this is we don't really actually have a very good idea of how large the effective population for size for ideas is. in the human population or how it's changing with the advent of social media and the internet. I think we have a reasonable idea that a while ago with big newsrooms, et cetera, that it wasn't actually very large. There were only a few people that were really actively involved in spreading ideas around. But in the article, I used the example of coal-burning power plants. And now, I guess people that aren't in the coal industry don't think coal-burning power plants are that great. But I use that as an example of how you might go through the calculations based on sort of how many people are claimed to be hurt by coal-burning power plants to try and estimate how large the actual population size of people sort of actively exchanging ideas are and essentially how many people can be hurt or die a year in the United States without actually having an effect on whether or not an idea is perceived as good or bad in terms of its evolution.
So how do you think this applies to conspiracy theories then?
Conspiracy theories do sort of have an adaptive advantage in that they do seem to appeal to sort of the way the human brain works. But I think it's also relevant in that the ideas that they're propounding aren't necessarily very strongly negative, so that they can be really hard to eliminate from the population because you aren't really selecting against people that have these ideas. And then the other thing that comes into it is that conspiracy theories can occur easily and change rapidly. So even if you are selecting against one, you're going to be having a lot of different theories coming into the population. And even if most of them are eliminated, because of that large number of ideas being generated, and we're talking about chance effects, then the odds are that some are going to propagate and become relatively well known in the population, even without having any particular appeal to anyone. So there are some that have, I think, a great deal of appeal to certain individuals, and then there are some that are very difficult for the majority of the population to understand how anybody would buy into them, but they still persist. The suggestion would be that those are ideas that just kept propagating because they got lucky at one point and they may be on their way out, but it's hard to tell.
So just to be clear, though, this is rampant speculation.
As far as I know, this is rampant speculation. There are people who professionally work on the evolution of memes. But for me, this was really sitting down as a thought exercise and trying to talk about aspects of evolutionary theory that aren't really frequently talked about in public in a way that hopefully is accessible to people who don't have a very strong biological background.
And we will post the link to your piece on the show notes for this episode.
Great, thank you.
So Josh, thanks very much for being here.
Okay, it was my pleasure.
So since this is the conspiracy theory episode, I wanted to pack as much conspiracy into one episode as I can. And so I'm here with Kim Hebert, occupational therapist and contributor to skepticnorth.com. Hello, Kim.
Hello.
So I wanted to have you come on the show today to talk about a post you wrote for Skeptic North. So give us some backstory here.
Well, basically, Bryce Wild is a homeopath in Ontario, and he was on Canada AM a few weeks ago promoting a natural first aid kit, he called it, that had some homeopathic creams. But unfortunately, there's no solid proof that they work. So I wrote an article critical of that and of Canada AM for not having a science-based health professional give advice that has, proof for basically what they're recommending.
And so you wrote that post, and Bryce responded.
Yeah, he responded to that. He wrote a comment that had 21 papers in it that he said were a few of his favorite. So I decided to go through each one, and another Skeptic North blogger, Scott Cover, actually helped me with a few of those. And I just basically wanted to see whether or not they were convincing for his argument that homeopathy is effective for the treatment of first aid.
And the result was?
Well, unfortunately, most of the papers didn't have anything to do with first aid, but I read through them anyway, just as a general evidence for homeopathy as a whole. I'm not sure that he actually expected me to read them, but because this kind of thing happens a lot for contentious topics where bloggers don't often have time to access all of these papers and address a huge list like that. And this tactic is, it's kind of meant to fluster your opponent by just dumping a lot of information on at once. But I did have the time, so I went through and I read them all, and pretty much the evidence was not super convincing. A lot of the studies had various problems with the methodology. Their statistics weren't applied correctly. They had very low numbers in the studies, so you couldn't really apply the conclusions to a broader population.
Just to clarify this, now these were Bryce's favorite studies.
Yeah, I mean, he indicated in his comment, he said, these are a few of my favorite studies. Here you go. So in that context, I expected, if he's trying to convince someone critical of his advice, that he had chosen papers that he thought were persuasive in that argument. So with that in mind, I went and looked at the papers.
So favorite studies does imply that they are among the best studies.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and especially given that he's a TV personality, he's in the media a lot in Ontario, and I figure if someone has got the evidence to support homeopathy, well, this guy should have it.
Now, nobody does this, Kim. Nobody actually goes to check all of the studies that someone references.
Very true. Luckily, I work part-time, so I had time on my hands.
No, and that's brilliant. That's the reason that I wanted you to come onto the show. Many of us are in that position at some point where we're debating with someone and we have half a dozen studies thrown at us by people who say that these studies are in favor of their claim. And most of us don't have the time or the inclination or really the skills to go and research the studies ourselves. So I do want people to know that this post does exist. It's about the efficacy of homeopathy, and people can use this as a resource.
Definitely. I do see these kinds of lists around a lot, particularly in the comment sections of skeptical websites. That someone will come on with a comment and just dump a bunch of very similar studies, if not the exact same studies, and people just don't have time to address them, like you say. So anyone who wants to go and use that as a resource is very welcome to.
So do you think that this will change the minds of people who believe that homeopathy works?
I don't think so. And the reason I say that is I think part of the support for homeopathy comes from people believe wholeheartedly that it works and tend to evaluate evidence in a way that is really positive and kind of ignore the more negative aspects of it. And that was part of my goal in writing this, is to provide that critical appraisal, just to let people know, like, there are some flaws in these studies and they are relevant. And while you could do that with any topic, a lot of these problems with the homeopathic papers in particular are fundamental flaws. And presenting a large list like that gives a sense of false support. And when you go back and look at the conclusions of the papers, some of the papers that he presented had negative conclusions. And he was presenting them as papers to support his position. So it's just a matter of going and looking and seeing what they've done, how they've done it, was it good quality evidence, and presenting that view.
So I've also noticed that people who use homeopathy frequently attribute evidence-based articles, like the ones you wrote, to the writer being a shill for Big Pharma.
Yeah, my checks come on Thursdays. Yeah, I have no ties with, I'm an occupational therapist. I don't work with drug companies. Sometimes I do work with companies. We order equipment, but that's a matter of a client decision. I don't receive any kind of gratuity whatsoever from any company.
So what would you and other bloggers have to gain?
I really don't know. I think that there's kind of this perception that we're promoting the status quo, and there's certain remedies from the pharmaceutical industry that are big money makers. But when you consider that homeopathy, if it worked, you could take a tiny drop of active ingredient and dilute it a lot to make a lot of medicine, and you could provide medicine for entire third world countries, and it would be awesome if homeopathy worked, but the evidence just isn't there to suggest that it does. So I'm really not sure what they think we have to gain. And it's particularly interesting they make that claim, because often I'll see, and Bryce was doing this in his interview, is promoting products. He was promoting arnica and calendula creams. So the same argument could be said for promoters of homeopathy, really.
Well, I'll let you get back to counting your money, Kim.
Yep, thick bills.
Thanks for being on the show.
Thank you, Desiree.
And we'll be right back with more Skeptically Speaking after this.
Skeptically Speaking wants you to question everything. You can email your questions for next week's episode to live@skepticallyspeaking.com, or if you're on Twitter, we're at Skeptical Radio, or use our handy question submission box on the website at skepticallyspeaking.com. After the show, continue the conversation in the comments section of the website, or check out our Facebook group. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, and while you're there, why not add a review of the show? Skeptically Speaking is rebroadcast on a number of wonderful radio stations. Check the media page at skepticallyspeaking.com to see if we air near you. And now, back to the show.
Welcome back to Skeptically Speaking. I'm your host, Desiree Schell. I'm here today with Karl Mamer, Director of Marketing and Communications at a Toronto software company. Karl has lived in Montreal, Toronto, Seattle, and Seoul, Korea, and is also host of the Conspiracy Skeptic podcast. Welcome to the show, Karl.
Hey, Desiree, how are you doing? It's a pleasure to be on.
Thank you. Very nice to have you here. So, does being in marketing give you any kind of advantage when you're analyzing conspiracy theories?
No, I don't think so. I think it just sort of buys me the luxury of time to sort of pursue these things.
So you can't predict which conspiracies have all the correct elements to stick around for a while?
No, absolutely not.
Because there are a lot of them, really. A lot.
For sure. They follow along certain common themes, but you're right, there are all kinds of conspiracies out there to sort of meet everybody's sort of taste and political outlook.
Well, let's start out by looking at some of the specific conspiracies that you've covered on your program. Maybe let's start with crop circles. Now, we know that crop circles are created by people, but the conspiracy is that they're actually what?
Well, obviously, sort of a lot of the conspiracy people, or crop circle believers, or croppies, as maybe sort of people call them, they believe they're being caused by aliens, or some people, think, some sort of unknown natural cause. But for the most part, it's sort of follow along aliens.
So it is from extraterrestrials, they think. What do they look to as evidence for this?
Basically, it's just sort of the argument from, personal incredulity that, no way could, three guys with sort of boards and rope do this in a night. So, therefore, it has to be space aliens, because I can't really think of another, alternative explanation. Sometimes they have other kind of tests, like, the wheat that's sort of crushed is, crushed in a certain way and has certain chemical properties, or they find certain chemicals in the dirt and stuff like that. But, there's also a very big active hoaxing community out there who read, the crop circle people. They read their literature and they sort of take it that as sort of a gauntlet, sort of thrown down and go, oh, okay, that's the feature of a crop circle made by space aliens that humans cannot possibly do. Well, game on. So
that's the thing. There are many people who have admitted openly and written about conducting these hoaxes. It's been thoroughly documented. So how is that explained to people who believe it? They just assume that the hoaxers are lying, or that only some of the crop circles are hoaxes?
Well, I think this is where the kind of the conspiracy sort of comes in, where that these people are disinformation agents sent by the CIA or MI6 or MI5, one of those sort of the British equivalent of the CIA. This is largely kind of a born in UK conspiracy, or bit of born in UK woo.
So what benefit could there be for tricking people into believing that alien crop circles are made by people? Trying to get the angle here.
Just to see it in the headlines the next day kind of thing. And just to have people sort of proclaim that, no way could humans do this. I mean, how wonderful is that?
I guess what I'm asking is, what do the believers think would be the benefit to the government covering it up?
Well, obviously, the same old story about, this is crystal clear evidence that, UFOs are here and they don't want to panic the population, that sort of thing.
Let's keep going along the alien thought process. Is there a specific conspiracy around abductions, or do they vary?
The whole abduction thing, it changes over the years, and it probably changes a lot, too, with sort of, the current sort of zeitgeist. But sometimes, the current zeitgeist is that this is, these abduction things are positive, that people are being brought up to spacecraft and told important messages about the future, or how we all have to live in, harmony, or we can't destroy our environment. And then there are certain sort of periods, in history, probably like the 1980s, where, it took a very malevolent tone, that, these space aliens, they were now capturing these people and performing ghastly medical experiments on them and implanting, messages in their brains for them to do terrible things, like get divorced from their wife or something.
Terrible. So, now you say this happened in the 80s, that things took a malevolent turn. Was that attached to a certain catalyst of some kind?
This is purely speaking from kind of a pop psychology angle, but, if you look at the 80s, we had, Reagan and Bush, and we had the Cold War. The Cold War was really heating up, and everyone was talking about, we can win a nuclear war and things like this. So obviously there was a lot of anxiety in the population, and so that could be sort of a reflection in sort of the abduction meme.
So interesting. So people transfer all of those economic fears to aliens.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and that's probably ultimately one of the cores of, why there are conspiracies or why they're so widely believed by a certain percentage of the population, that, it's about sort of focusing anxiety on one specific tangible or seemingly tangible target or enemy.
How about the crash at Roswell? That's really the mother of all alien conspiracies. Can you give us some background on that?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it was in the sort of mid to late 40s, shortly after, the discovery of nuclear weapons. And what is key is this is before the Soviet Union had developed an atomic bomb. So, as the story goes, that a, alien spacecraft kind of crashed around Roswell, New Mexico, and the saucer was recovered and some bodies were recovered, and there were a couple people in the community that sort of witnessed various portions of this, and but the government sort of covered it all up, and anybody that was kind of involved was sort of told to shut up or be killed or something like that, and people were made to disappear and things like that. But the non-amazing explanation is that it was something called Project Mogul, where, this is also before satellites. So the U.S. government was sort of interested, when is the Soviet Union going to develop nuclear weapons? And, how are we going to even know, they've tested a nuclear weapon? So they were trying to develop these high-altitude balloons with very sensitive microphones that would, be able to sort of pick up basically the sound of detonations, in the middle of the Soviet Union. And in one of these balloons sort of crashed, and they have very good records showing what balloons have crashed and what kind of their direction they're flying in and things like that. So obviously letting people kind of think maybe there was a space alien crash sort of covers that story up pretty nicely.
So how do people who believe in that conspiracy counter that kind of evidence?
Again, the government's just, inventing more excuses kind of thing. You can keep asking the government to sort of, search its records and conduct another investigation. But if they're not coming up with the answer, is the true answer, then it's always just very easy to sort of write it off as, just another government cover-up.
And, of course, evidence of how good the cover-up is.
Well, exactly. It's sort of like the absence of any evidence for the conspiracy is almost to many evidence of the conspiracy. That this just shows you how amazingly powerful these people are, right?
You're listening to Skeptically Speaking. I'm on the air with Karl Mamer, host of the Conspiracy Skeptic podcast. Email us at live@skepticallyspeaking.com or tweet us at Skeptical Radio. Now, human endeavors in space are another focal point for conspiracies, and the big one, of course, being that the Apollo moon landings were faked.
Yeah, that's probably one of the most irritating ones out there, just because I was born in 1966, and as a child I remember watching some of the moon landings on television, and it's just sort of a wonderful period of history, and to have these people sort of claim that this didn't happen is just, you don't want to sleep at night.
Well, where did the hoax theorists say that the landings were staged?
I think it was basically in maybe Area 51, kind of on a sound stage in some Air Force hangar and some secret base, probably Area 51.
So there was no flag, no nothing. Everything was set up. We never left planet Earth.
That's what they claim, yes. There are also, of course, variations to that too, that the astronauts did get on the Apollo moon rocket and they took off, and sometimes they claim, well, they just sort of orbited the Earth a little bit and then splashed down, and other people claim, well, they went around the moon, but they never actually landed. So it depends who you talk to.
So on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being nobody's ever bothered and 10 being everybody and their dog has taken a crack at this, how thoroughly has the evidence of a hoax in this area been debunked?
I would say pretty thoroughly. I believe there's a website called, I think it's clavius.org or something like that. And they kind of have every little piece of, not even evidence, but every little moon landing hoax claim that sort of comes up, they investigate this, and they show why that's wrong, what the evidence is, things like that. So, I mean, it is very well debunked. Just as, say, creationism, there's a lot of websites out there that sort of, very methodically sort of, here's the claim, here's why that claim is wrong, here's the evidence.
But in both theories, people haven't been persuaded at all away from their belief.
No, for sure. I mean, there's always going to be a subset of people that they're motivated to believe, so you'll never really be able to sort of change their mind. But then, there's always the fence sitters that, you can definitely change their mind. I mean, a lot of times people, this is the only thing they've heard, right? That say, like the Roswell story. This is sort of the only sort of side they've heard. And once you kind of present them with, sort of a natural explanation, or when it doesn't necessarily involve UFOs, a lot of they'll come down on your side. So, I mean, not all hope is lost.
Now, there are lots of conspiracy theories that are more down to earth. For example, high-profile deaths. Diana was one, but the most famous is probably still JFK.
Yeah, for sure. For, I guess, our younger people in our audience, John F. Kennedy, right? He was the president in the 1960s, and he was sort of driving through Dallas in sort of an open car, and, as the official story goes, a lone gunman named Lee Harvey Oswald from sort of a book depository, with sort of a sniper rifle, sort of, I believe, fired 3 shots, and one sort of was not a fatal wound, and one was sort of the kill shot sort of took off part of Kennedy's head. So, but of course, the conspiracy people sort of claim that there was a second gunman, or that Oswald was a patsy. Oswald could not have made the shot. I mean, they sort of look at every single aspect of Kennedy's ride through Dallas, and at every point try to point out, well, this could not have possibly happened this way, this could not have possibly happened that way, and that's usually the feature of almost all conspiracies, is they don't really have what you would call like positive evidence for them. They have what you call anomaly hunting, people just sort of claiming, well, the official story could not have happened this way because of this anomaly.
Well, is this the only political assassination that spawned such a high-profile conspiracy before?
Well, I mean, not really. I mean, of course, John F. Kennedy's brother, Bobby Kennedy, again, there's conspiracies about that. I mean, as you said, Princess Di, Martin Luther King. Even sort of rolling forward into more recent memory was a conspiracy called the Clinton body count, where apparently President Clinton, someone sort of went through, all the people who sort of, knew the president, worked for the president, the president served the president coffee, and sort of compiled this list of, all these people have died, and so their hypothesis is that Clinton was sort of killing these people because they knew too much or something, and it became known as the Clinton body count. But if you sort of look at this list and you go, well, okay, this one guy was like, he was a cop on Clinton's motorcade once, and he was a cop, and police officers, they have risky jobs, and a lot of times people who come in contact with presidents, they have risky jobs, and unfortunately some of them die.
And we have a question from the chat room.
What's the wildest, most out-of-left-field conspiracy you've ever heard? Conversely, what conspiracy theories made you wonder if they were correct?
Yeah, well, definitely the Clinton body count, I have to sort of say, is the sort of the wildest, if only because of the name. It's kind of amusing. Let's see, I spent a lot of time sort of talking about the on my show the Bilderbergers, which is basically kind of I believe once a year, people from government and industry and even like European royalty, they all sort of get together in a very fancy hotel someplace in Europe or North America, and they get together and they sort of talk about politics and economics and stuff like this, and while I don't think they're there sort of planning how to exterminate 9/10 of the population, sometimes I sort of think that maybe if they're attending as sort of private citizens, that's one thing, but sometimes a little bit too much government money kind of goes into these otherwise sort of very private off the record meetings, and so I do think sometimes the conspiracy theorists aren't right, but in one small pocket they do have a point that if government money is going into these Bilderberger meetings, that they should be on the record.
You're listening to Skeptically Speaking, and today we're discussing conspiracy theories. Karl Mamer, host of the podcast The Conspiracy Skeptic, is with us, and we are taking questions. Email us at live@skepticallyspeaking.com or tweet us at Skeptical Radio. So another kind of conspiracy theory are the ones that have grown up around specific areas of science, and I find those very interesting. Climate change is a big one. So what's the conspiracy there?
Obviously, there is a scientific consensus out there. It's maybe not as strong for, let's say, evolution or, Big Bang or, things like that, but there still is an emerging consensus that global warming is happening, climate change is happening, and there's definitely a human contribution. But then, of course, there are people who some people have a very vested interest, obviously, in sort of denying that global warming is happening, but other people sometimes, too, are just, they just always doubt the official story. It doesn't matter what the official story is, they just always doubt the official story. And so, obviously, they don't believe, climate change is happening.
So do they think that there's a specific person or group forcing people to believe in it?
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's it's the same old story, whether it's like, theory of evolution or, HIV or things like that, there's a small cabal of scientists out there who get millions and millions of dollars for research, and they don't want their little gravy train to ever be, stopped or tilted over. So, they don't let any kind of dissenting views come in, or they don't let the dissenters publish their papers, things like that.
We have a question from the website.
Evolution is often portrayed as a conspiracy by scientists. What do the believers think that the scientists stand to gain by suppressing the evidence for intelligent design? And that's from K.O. Myers.
Again, a lot of times it's just pure money, right? That that these guys like P.Z. Myers, they're millionaires, aren't they? Sort of researching, evolutionary biology, and they don't want to, they don't want to have to go find real jobs, right? But at the same time, there's also sort of a view among these people that scientists are sort of afraid to abandon their materialist paradigm, that that they're hardcore atheists, and anything that sort of might upset the materialist paradigm, that that everything has a natural cause, and there is no God, that they're afraid to sort of abandon that. And so, I mean, I believe it was Richard Dawkins who said that that evolution kind of allows sort of atheists to be fully realized atheists, that it's sort of the last kind of gap to be explained.
And another question from the website.
The website Conservapedia recently claimed that Einstein's theory of relativity was really a conspiracy to promote moral relativism. Do you think that there are more conspiracies coming from the right wing or the left wing? And do you associate specific differences in the types of conspiracies with each party?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're probably getting equal numbers, but I've not done a study, and I'm sure no one has ever really published a paper about this. But it's my personal feeling that both sides of the political spectrum, cook up equal amounts of conspiracies. The left wing tends to sort of it internalize it, that there are elements within the nation that are out to keep the poor and oppressed down, whereas as sort of the right wing, they sort of see forces outside of America. There are people, we got a pretty good thing going on in America, and and there are people outside that want to kind of take it from us, whether it's to build a Bilderbergs or so petrodollars or things like that.
So a recent conspiracy theory that sort of combines elements of historical conspiracy theories and science is the 9/11 Truth Movement. So they believe that the destruction of the World Trade Center and the attack on the Pentagon were actually staged by the U.S. government.
That's one you could almost sort of say is a left-wing conspiracy, but there's also obviously a lot of sort of right-wing people too that are behind that. I mean, that all sort of transpired under George W. Bush's watch, and we had 8 years of sort of kind of Clinton liberal rule, and times were good and stuff like that. And then sort of Bush came in, and he's sort of pushing a very right-wing agenda and very religious agenda, and and so the people on the left began to sort of feel like a loss of power, and that's another sort of feature of a lot of conspiracies, that when people start to feel a loss of their own power, they begin to cook up conspiracies.
Well, let's start to get into what sort of all of these conspiracies do have in common. So in all of these, you were talking about a loss of control, but it definitely does seem to be focused on the government in many cases.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times the government, but just not necessarily the government. Sometimes the government's just, a stooge in a sort of a bigger game. But, there's very, very little sort of psychological research out there. But there was one guy, I think in the early 90s, I think his name was Getzel. He was a sociologist, and he sort of started investigating sort of the psychology of conspiracy believers. And he generally found that they had a condition called anomia, where it's sort of a feeling like you're kind of alienated from the system, you're alienated from culture, and these people also sort of have a feeling they tend to distrust other people, and a lot of times they're very insecure about their employment. So a lot of times when people, as I was saying before, when people sort of feel like they're about to they're maybe losing power, whether it's old rich white men or young university graduates who thought this, wonderful sort of liberal rule would continue forever. Once they begin to sort of feel a bit of a loss of power, and sometimes they begin to, sort of cook up conspiracy theories.
So is this one way of gaining, I guess, a certain comfort or maybe even a sense of superiority that comes from being one of the people who are smart enough to see through the sham?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a little bit of both. It's a big random world out there that a lot of times we have no control over. And so people kind of want to merge all of this randomness and sort of blame it on one big evil enemy out there. It's better to have one big evil enemy out there that you can maybe take down than, a whole bunch of little enemies that you're going to spend the rest of your lifetime sort of, kind of whack-a-mole, sort of knocking out.
Right. Well, isn't there a certain amount of cognitive dissonance here, though? Because on the one hand, governments and scientists and secret organizations or what have you are powerful enough to suppress the knowledge of their sinister activities. But on the other hand, they're obviously not terribly good at it because people have found out.
Yeah. I mean, that's the wonderful thing about talking to conspiracy theorists, and that's almost the game, thinking you've got them in the most wonderful bind in their logic, and then they sort of find another way out. And obviously the one you're sort of referring to is, the people who are perpetrating conspiracies are supposed to be these all-powerful entities out there, but then they kind of make all these really fundamental errors that some schlub like me can sort of, spot and then sort of post on Twitter or devote a web page to, and again, that seems sort of contradictory. But then a lot of times the conspiracy theorists will go, but obviously there's sort of one guy within the organization, and he is against the conspiracy, and he's sort of letting these errors kind of slip out there, so as sort of warning signs to the people who are paying attention. So that's kind of the way they sort of rationalize it.
And we touched on this before, but I'm wondering if we can talk about it some more. I find it interesting that conspiracy theorists often use any evidence that contradicts their claims as evidence for the size and power of the conspiracy.
Yeah, I mean, as well, that's all sort of blends into the idea that if you don't believe the conspiracy, it kind of goes one of two ways. If you are either what they call sheeple. I think Alex Jones, he's sort of a big-time conspiracy guy. Alex Jones, that might be his term, or he just merely popularized it. So you're either sort of the sheeple, kind of, you just don't know what's going on, or maybe you've been told, but you sort of you're trying to be actively ignorant of it because you just want to continue with your good little life. And then there's the other people who are, that they must be paid stooges of the conspiracy.
Right.
So, so they're disinfo agents and things like that. You've probably got that accusation yourself.
Yes,
at some
I have.
Point. Yeah. So, yeah, we tend to wear it as sort of a badge of honor, I think.
So the Righteous Indignation podcast a while back held a make-your-own conspiracy theory contest. Now, I have a listener, Jameson Phoenix. He sent me his entry about the tornadoes being a government plot, and it pointed out all of the inconsistencies of various accounts of tornadoes as evidence for a conspiracy, of course. So is that all it takes? Just any inconsistency in a story is enough to make it a conspiracy?
Nearly so. I mean, like I was saying before, conspiracy theories, unless they're sort of real conspiracy theories, and they tend to just lack positive evidence. Look, here's a paper from the CIA, ordering the hit on Kennedy. I would buy that as evidence of conspiracy. But most conspiracies just tend to be, like, say, anomaly hunting. Like, this looks like a mistake. This doesn't make sense based on what I know of, how buildings fall down or how people walk on the moon, things like that.
So is it all basically an argument from personal incredulity?
Yeah, I would say nearly so. I mean, the other sort of fallacy, it's called the narrative fallacy. I forget his name. He's sort of an economist who's sort of famous for this whole sort of black swan concept. I believe he coined the term, the narrative fallacy, where you kind of look at just a bunch of very random events, and we don't like the randomness. So we kind of make a narrative that sort of ties all these random events together and sort of leads to sort of an end goal. And people ultimately like it's called sort of a teleological explanation. They like that things have a reason, that that causes have a reason. For example, if you ask like a child, why does it rain? If you give them the scientific explanation, or you'd say because it makes plants grow, children love the second explanation because it gives rain a purpose. So people tend to sort of want to look at random events and give them a purpose. Even if it has an evil purpose, they're at least comforted to knowing that there's a plan out there.
We have a question from the website.
Do you see any distinct differences between American and Canadian conspiracies?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, to sort of sum it up in 2 sentences, a lot of American conspiracies are about foreign forces wanting to take away Americans' guns, whereas in Canadian conspiracies, it's about these foreign forces basically, forcing guns on us, because in Canada, we tend to, a lot of times we tend to value, rightly or wrongly, we tend to value ourselves as being the not Americans. We've got the socialized medicine. We're a fairly gun-free culture. And so we're afraid of losing that in kind of a North American Union, that all these sort of, these terrible American ideas about private medical care and, gun ownership, that's going to come up to Canada and you won't be able to go to Walmart without having to pack a gun.
I very much like your explanation, but I'm also thinking it seems that American conspiracies are quite often built around some idea of government being the enemy, and Canadian conspiracies are quite often corporation-based.
Yes, absolutely. Which is weird because it's like you take the same conspiracy, let's say North American Union, the idea that, within 2 years we're going to be all one country and sharing a common currency called the Amero, and there's going to be, a highway running through all of our nations or something. The Americans tend to sort of view this as, those socialists. This is, going to be a socialization of America, and, the government's sort of helping. Whereas in Canada, we tend to view it as like, this is just like a power grab by the, the corporations and, the moneyed people. So same conspiracy, just when you cross the border, different political forces are at work, which makes you go, huh?
Would you like to hazard a guess as to why that is?
Oh, yeah. I mean, definitely, Americans are always very suspicious of large concentrations of power, hence sort of their constitution, their separation of power. So they've got, sort of legislative branch and, they've got the president who can veto, and they've got the Supreme Court and stuff like that. Whereas, in Canada, for benefit of American listeners, effectively every 4 or 5 years, unless we have a minority government, we elect almost an absolute monarchy. We hand them incredible amounts of power for 4 or 5 years at a time, and they usually don't.
We don't mind so much.
I don't know if I can use bad words on this show, but they don't sort of mess us over too badly,
right?
So Canadians we're less suspicious of large concentrations of power, but that has just changed in the last 10 years, I would have to say.
You're tuned in to Skeptically Speaking, and this is your last chance to ask a question about your favorite completely implausible conspiracy theory. Email us at live@skepticallyspeaking.com or tweet us at Skeptical Radio. And we'll be right back after this.
On the next episode of Skeptically Speaking, we're joined by Sharon Birch McGrain. The author of Nobel Prize Women in Science returns to tell us more about the most influential women in the history of modern science. And on Speaking Up, our own Ryan Bromsgrove explains everything you need to know about quantum misappropriations. That's next week on Skeptically Speaking, Friday night at 6 Mountain Time at skepticallyspeaking.com.
Welcome back to Skeptically Speaking. I'm your host, Desiree Schell, and I'm here with Karl Mamer, host of the Conspiracy Skeptic podcast. So let's talk about the consequences of conspiracy thought. Something like the moon hoax, let's say. Believing that Neil Armstrong was bouncing around a soundstage, probably fairly harmless, but...
Yeah, reasonably harmless.
Reasonably?
Well, for the sake of argument. I mean, it might make people want to sort of fund space exploration less, things like that, but it probably won't kill anybody.
Okay, well, that's good. But there are other so-called conspiracies that have caused big, real-world problems, like global warming, for example.
Yeah. I don't think we've probably seen the full effects of, say, maybe global warming denial at this point. Maybe not. But, definitely things, let's say, like, HIV denial or, vaccine denial or even, this return of germ theory denial. These things have a body count. I forget who put up the website, but someone put up a rather good website, sort of the body count associated with vaccine denial. So yeah, for sure. I mean, some of these conspiracy theories can definitely kill people.
That's actually the Jenny McCarthy body count.
Right, yes, yes.
Right. And Derek Bartholomew actually created that. So that actually, you're right, that does come with a body count. So wasn't there actually a similar campaign by the tobacco industry to discredit the science about the health effects of smoking?
Right, for sure. And oddly enough, right, a lot of these sort of people who sort of led that charge are now sort of working the global warming denial camp. I believe they even coined a term that sort of in skepticism we've kind of appropriated as our own, and it's a great term. It's just said that it kind of came from the the smoking denial people, but I think they call it junk science. That was sort of their big kind of term back during the I guess it was the 60s or the 70s. That any kind of research that sort of tied smoking to cancer, they claimed it was junk science.
Right. So are there any other conspiracy theories that you think are doing a lot of damage?
HIV denial is one that's really, it fascinates me, but obviously I think it's killing a lot of people, especially say like in Africa, like we saw in South Africa, right, where I believe their health minister and even I think their president were sort of believed it was all a hoax, and that the antiretroviral medication was causing HIV or causing AIDS, these kinds of things. So to me, I think that's the most damaging, but it's probably running neck and neck with vaccine denial.
Well, I'm wondering, how about the Tea Party movement? Now, we're Canadians, so we can speak completely freely about American politics with no repercussions at all. So would you consider them conspiracy theorists? And I'm separating the Obama won't show us his birth certificate people from the Tea Party, and I realize there's overlap, but let's consider them separate.
For sure, yeah. I was at TAM 8 in Vegas, back in the summer, and before TAM 8, I was sort of hanging around with a bunch of like magicians and jugglers and things like that, and a lot of these people were sort of donating their time to like a Tea Party rally, which sort of made me go, huh? Because these people are definitely skeptics, and some of them even attended TAM, and so to sort of categorize the whole Tea Party movement as sort of being one thing is probably wrong. But like you say, within the Tea Party movement, there are definitely, like the called the birthers, people who don't believe, Obama was born in America and therefore can't be president. But at the end of the day, they've not really killed any people. Like they turn out to their little rallies and they've got really badly worded signs and they're kind of laughable, but they pack up and they go home. They don't sort of smash Starbucks windows and turn over police cars and burn them or anything like that. And
right.
Which is sort of like, in Toronto we had a meeting of the G20 and that didn't end well, right? And this is sort of kind of a feature of a lot of these, G20 and sort of globalization sort of meetings that the left, or, a lot of them are on the left, they're leaving violence and destruction in their wake, and somehow we're not worried about that. We're not upset about that or paranoid about that as maybe we should be. Whereas we're just waiting for one of those Tea Party guys to pull the trigger, and then we're going to go, oh my God.
That is an interesting point, sir. Definitely. Now we have another chat room question.
Would a focus on better scientific literacy or education help mitigate the draw of conspiracy theories? That's from Mary Melody XX.
I would like to think a lot more critical, sort of critical thinking, like what I call informal logic, or what which people sort of recognize as all the logical fallacies, like post hoc reasoning and things like that. I would love to see those things sort of being taught at at least the high school level, because I believed in a lot of this stuff until I sort of started taking those sort of courses in university, and that's probably a roundabout way I came to sort of really liking conspiracy theories, because they're so loaded with logical fallacies that they're sort of fun to pick apart. And so if people were just sort of shown how to approach arguments critically and sort of taught to look for the natural explanation first, apply Occam's razor to these things, that maybe the conspiracies would not be so rampant at times.
But there are things that have turned out to be conspiracies.
Yeah, for sure. That's one of the accusations I guess maybe people will level at me from time to time. I gotta admit, I don't get a lot of nasty email or even critical, even slightly critical email. I'm quite glad about that. But, a lot of times people will say, well, I guess you just don't believe there's any conspiracies out there, which is not true. Definitely, there are definitely real conspiracies out there, like the Gulf of Tonkin incident that sort of precipitated the war in Vietnam, or America's involvement in the war in Vietnam. If you remember back in the 80s, arms for hostages, where sort of certain rogue elements in the American government, they're basically sort of trading, missiles to Iran, to get hostages released, and then they were taking that money and then giving it to the Contras in Nicaragua and stuff like that. So, there are definitely real conspiracies out there.
Do you think maybe one of the problems is that it makes it more difficult to differentiate between is something a conspiracy theory or is something an actual social ill that we could be paying attention to? Do you think that this distracts people from real issues?
Definitely. I think a lot of times, like I was saying, people who are losing power, they want to frighten you, right? And say, here's something you really got to be worried about, and, by the way, I have the answer, or, I've got a product you can buy that will protect you from comets or something like that, right, that the government's not telling you about. And so, it can distract people from sort of the real problems. Clearly, let's say, Nazi Germany, right? They sort of scapegoated Jews to sort of cover up, their problems, and or South Africa, where they sort of those darn money grubbing pharmacy companies to cover up the real cracks in their healthcare system. So it can definitely be distraction as well. It can just be people looking to line their pockets and retain power and control.
So is there any way that us average people can differentiate between what a real conspiracy is and something like 9/11?
You have to sort of have to ask, give me positive evidence, and that to me is the one thing that sort of separates sort of a conspiracy theory, as we sort of like to call it, versus a real conspiracy that. And then you kind of got to ask yourself, is this an incredible claim? Would the American government really kill, 2,000, 3,000 people, in the World Trade Center and on those planes, to sort of, precipitate a war in Iraq when they could have done something else? If you remember the invasion of Panama, George Bush, the first Bush, he basically used an incident where a Panamanian soldier, kind of slapped a American soldier's wife, basically, and they use that as a pretext for an invasion. So you don't need much, right? You don't need to kill 3,000 people. And
that's our time. Thanks, Karl, very much for being on the show.
Well, it was a pleasure. I'm a longtime listener and first-time guest.
And you can listen to Karl on the Conspiracy Skeptic podcast at yrad.com/cs. And you can listen to our past episodes at skepticallyspeaking.com. Click the links to show your support on Facebook, on Twitter, or on iTunes, where you can subscribe to the show. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week on Skeptically Speaking.
G'day, blokes and sailors. How you bloody doing?
Elliot Birch here from the Young Australian Skeptics and the Pseudoscientist podcast. Just want to take a moment to talk to the Skeptically Speaking audience about why I think skepticism is the most important thing in the world. Skepticism is my shield, a shield of tasty delights. And this tasty marshmallow of justice protects us from the day-to-day battering we receive from pseudoscience and charlatanry. Whether it come from your family, your friends, or your co-workers, science and skepticism help you to defend against these things. Skepticism brings us closer to the objective truth, reality. I use this shield as a buffer, and it has helped train me to fight irrationality within my own mind and on the outside. What could be more important to yourself and to humanity than getting a little bit closer to knowing how the world works? From this comes amazing technology, medicine, and thinkers that enrich the world and make it a better place to live. Step back 150 years to when medicine was a mishmash of guessing and hocus pocus. The hardships that people faced back then are almost non-existent in first world society today. We have skepticism and science to thank for that. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. There are still battles to be won. People like the anti-vaccination movement set back medicine every time they are given public media exposure. It is our obligation as young people and as skeptics to be the voice of soothing reason within a mess of shrill irrationality. If we can do this, imagine where we could be in another 150 years.
Probably riding hoverboards.
Skeptics await your letter. Your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Desiree Shell, gonna raise a little hell, break the spell of Pavlov spells. Cause we're skeptically speaking, our mind reading tarot cards and witches, psychics, and their spoon bending mind tricks. I don't think you understand. It's the hocus pocus, out of focus locus, eroding the brain, making gains on the hopeless. Let the crystal ball fall, smash on the floor. Leave the pieces alone, we don't need them anymore. Just a microscope, telescope, magnifier, reading in between the lines of these lies. Bring it on, the skeptics await your letter, your call, tweet, homing, pigeon, whatever. Desiree Shell gonna raise a little hell, metaphorically that is, cause we're skeptically speaking.